Good evening. Welcome to the Wednesday, March 27th, 2024 special meeting of the Northampton School Committee. I am Mayor Jean Louise Scherer. I'll be presiding this evening. We are everyone who is participating on, this is a hybrid meeting pursuant to the state and the change in the open meeting law. And anyone who is participating both on Zoom or in the room is being audio and video recorded. And I would like to ask Dr. Bonner to please take the role of the school committee.
Member Mayor Gina Louise Scherer.
Here.
Member Holly Gazy. Here. I believe we actually have to record this.
No, but now we've been
so they have to come on. Okay.
Can you just pop up and say?
Present.
Member Karen Foster Cannon.
Here.
Member Emily Seraphy Cox, who is remote.
Yeah, I'm present.
Member Michael Stein. Member Michael Stein. He's not on that.
Can he unmute if he is on?
He's not on. I didn't see him come on. Not unless I'll double check.
Okay.
Member Ann Hennessy.
Present.
Member Margaret Miller.
Present.
Member Carrie Lavanti.
Here.
Member Gwen Agna. Member Aileen Davis.
Present.
Mary Pavlik.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for that. Okay. So, thank you, everyone, for joining us. I want to give a very special thank you to Tracy Novick. Tracy is the School Finance Field Director for the Massachusetts Association of School Committees, and I thank her for coming to Northampton this evening to help us understand our situation as a minimum aid community and the other factors impacting our Chapter 70 funding. We get a lot of questions around state aid or lack of state aid in our situation, but also importantly, there's a real interest in understanding what we should be advocating for and how best to advocate for what we should be asking our state legislators to push for to help us turn this tide and change the basically flat Chapter 70 that we have had for many, many years, despite growing required net school spending. So thank you again, Tracy, for coming to present to the Northampton School Committee to answer any of the school committee's questions. I know your expertise is in very high demand right now. And these conversations are happening all over the Commonwealth, so really deep gratitude for you for coming out here to talk to us tonight. I'll also note that superintendent of our other district, a unique aspect of Northampton, Dr. Lincoln Hoker of Smith Vocational and Agricultural High School is here. And I saw Senator Comerford is here, I think. Oh, hi. So I thank her so much for being here. And I thank her and Representative Sabadosa for their work and their advocacy around state funding for our public schools. So with that, I will hand it over to Tracy. Thank you.
Sure. So as the mayor knows, actually, I think a couple of you know, it doesn't take a lot to persuade me to come out to Northampton. I am guilty as charged among those who were educated up the hill. So coming back here feels a little bit like coming back home. I also was noting to your school committee that the last time that I was in this room, I was receiving my first COVID shot because I became eligible on my birthday, and it was one of those where during the scramble where you got up at some crazy hour and you actually just had opened the slots and your firefighters, who were lovely, were giving the shots that day. So nothing but happy memories here. So it's great to be with you. And yes, as was noted, this is a hot topic everywhere in Massachusetts this year. The crux of exactly how it is that aid comes to districts really is coming to the fore, and I have a school funding presentation, I think almost every single week between now and the end of May. So, and as you'll see, there's a lot of sort of granular stuff that goes into each one. So, but I'm glad to be here. So what this is doing is it's actually looking specifically, if I can advance my own slides. Oh, hang on, I need to give permission to be recorded. That's not a good sign. It was working before. And it acts like it's actually receiving it. Whoops.
Do you want me to sit here and advance it for you?
Well, where it is. Nope. Well, how close can that get to me, I guess is the question.
What was your question?
I guess I'm wondering how close it can get to me.
I'm very happy to sit here and you can just say, next slide.
Got more of that servant leadership happening here. So what this presentation will do is it will start by looking at Chapter 70 in terms of the where it comes from, what it's based on, and what the foundations of it is. Next slide. The first thing that I want to make sure that, common understanding of terminology here is that we sort of, particularly in the education universe, sort of toss around the term Chapter 70. And important to know, it's actually called Chapter 70 because it's Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 70, that describes how school funding in Massachusetts actually works. And this is Section 1, which just lays out what the plan is. So the intention of the state legislature, which the law refers to as the general court, is to assure fair and adequate minimum per student funding. That's the first half. By defining a foundation budget, and then also by defining a standard local funding effort applicable to every city and town in the Commonwealth. And we will talk about both halves of that. Now, as we at the local level, we do like to occasionally poke fun at the legislature because one of their favorite phrases appears to be subject to appropriation. Subject to appropriation, of course, means that if they actually fund it, but this does lay out at least what the intention is in terms of school funding in Massachusetts. Next slide. And so Chapter 70, you can click again. I'm sorry, there's lots of clicking involved in my slides. Just simply means state funding for education for K through 12. And that's the terminology we use. So the first question that essentially we ask, or that is asked by the law in putting this together, is what does it take to educate a child in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts? Now, just to sort of take a step back for a minute, the reason we have Massachusetts General Law Chapter 70, the reason that we have the state funding system that we do, is because in 1993, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts lost a lawsuit known as the McDuffie lawsuit. A number of school children, their parents on behalf of the school children, sued the Commonwealth of Massachusetts because the Constitution in Massachusetts says that it is the responsibility of the state, not the towns, to ensure that every child has an education. It's written right into the state constitution. Rather proud of the fact that that was written by John Adams, who, before he was famous, was a school teacher in Worcester, which is my hometown. And so there was a constitutional obligation on behalf of the state to do this. And so when the state lost the lawsuit, the legislature responded by passing what we refer to now as the Education Reform Law of 1993. Now, you may have heard of that in the past in response to things like MCAS, teacher licensure, the authorities of school committees, a whole bunch of other things. But at ground, it is a school funding law. And it enormously reformed how we fund schools in Massachusetts through the foundation budget. So a lot of what that lawsuit had been about, and if you are that kind of a person, I urge you to actually read the findings of the McDuffie case, is there actually being findings of testimony from superintendents and from families and so forth saying, this is what it's like to be a child in my school, this is what it's like to teach in my school system, and because it was being funded largely through local property taxes, which we know is an inherently inequitable way to fund schools. So part of what the state had to do then is say, okay, well, what does it take to educate a child in Massachusetts? And what they did was they broke it apart into a list of things. You can click the next couple here. Which essentially, if you sat down and made a list of what you thought it took to educate a kid or to run a school system, you probably would come up with most of these: administration, teachers, guidance and psychological services, benefits, materials and technology, and so forth. And in every case, what they did was they associated a dollar amount per pupil with each of these categories. And that was also then done by grade level. And so they divided it up into pre-K to K, to elementary, middle, high school, and vocational. And if we click again, you'll see that this is the foundation budget rates assigned in the governor's budget. That was what was proposed in January. at each of these various levels. Now, a couple things that are important in terms of this. Keep in mind that each of these columns does contain those individual pieces. We can actually go back in and I can tell you, for a kindergartner, how much of that dollar amount is associated with teaching, benefits, administration, and so forth. The other thing that I want to note here is the footnote on the bottom here, which is that we are 4 years into the biggest overhaul in education funding that has happened in the last 25, which is the Student Opportunity Act. And I know that there are people in this room who were heavily involved in getting that passed. Keep in mind that the Student Opportunity Act, when it was signed into law by Governor Baker, after it was passed by both chambers of the legislature unanimously, was at the end of a 4-year effort to have a response to the Foundation Budget Review Commission, which came out with their report in 2015, which itself was a response to years and years of advocacy before that to try to get the legislature to actually look at the foundation budget again. It was originally supposed to be looked at every 5 years. It took 25. You will hear me say this more than once this evening. The Student Opportunity Act says that it's supposed to take 10. We're 4 in, arguably 5. Probably need to start our advocacy yesterday. So, a couple of things that are within this from the Student Opportunity Act. Guidance and psychological services has been going up. Benefits, which was considered one of the big 4 things that were heavily undercalculated by the previous foundation budget, is also going up. In every case, they're going up to a goal that was written into the Student Opportunity Act in terms of the dollar amount. Originally, SOA was supposed to be implemented over 7 years. We kind of had something happen in March of 2020 that meant that that first year of implementation didn't happen. Legislature has responded, and the executive branch has responded, by implementing over 6 instead, and this is another 1/6 towards that. The rates, among other things, of course, looking at vocational, for example, include the idea that vocational has almost twice as many teachers, they have to, thus smaller class sizes and significantly more needs for equipment. And I will nod, by the way, to the fact that Smithville also has cows as a Secretary of Education once very excitedly announced at a school, as a Board of Ed meeting. One of my favorite things about Smithville. So keep that in mind. So that's what's going on with these. Now remember, all we're doing at this point is calculating how much does it cost. We're not talking yet about how much anybody's going to pay. All right, next slide. So to those base foundation amounts, we then are going to add 2 additional increments. One for English learners, one for low-income students. So the next slide, for English learners, this is another thing that is going up as a result of the Student Opportunity Act. We're in the 4th year of implementation. Part of what the legislature was aiming to do in SOA was something that we achieved for the first time last year, which is that originally high school was not the largest amount. Now, if you know anything at all about English language acquisition, and you think about how long we have students, you know that if we have students that are still considered English learners in high school, we only have so much time left with them, there's going to be a greater allocation of resources needed in order to actually give them the support that they need. That sort of passing each other happened last year, but these are, again, in the 4th year of moving up towards goal rates for the 6 years of implementation. Next slide. Now the one with the big money, and I'm sorry the contrast isn't as good as it could be here. You'll have to imagine it based on where the white lines are, but is the low income. And part of what happened in the Foundation Budget Review Commission testimony was there was a significant amount of testimony around the needs of students who are living in poverty and the involved response then of school districts that have high concentrations of students who are in poverty. And then what did that actually end up meaning for the school districts to be able to respond to that? And so there's a couple of reforms that happened as a result of the Student Opportunity Act. One is that this used to be divided into deciles, so even tenths. It now is divided into 12ths, which is not duodeciles, by the way, because they're not even. And the particular thing where it's actually going up significantly progressively towards the end was a significant part of the reform. Such that by the time we get to full implementation in 2 more years, the intent of the law is that for group 12, which is 80% or more of your students are considered low income, that bar will be fully as much as the middle school base foundation amount. In other words, it will be essentially equivalent to another 100% of that funding within the foundation budget for the highest concentration of low-income pupils. Again, this is a per pupil amount. If we click again, this is what Northampton this year, for FY25, Northampton is group 6. Northampton Public Schools have a 33.64% low income rate for this year. I am going to just sort of mention in passing, this isn't something that impacts Northampton this year. It does impact some of your other sort of, not neighboring districts, but not too far away districts. Because the low income determination is done based on direct certification, which means that the students are enrolled in other state programs, for the most part, there is a supplemental process. And the biggest list of that is Mass Health, students who are enrolled in Mass Health. Many of you may know that the state, along with everywhere else, had to go through a redetermination process starting a year ago, March. And it was all sort of frozen during what was considered the pandemic emergency. When that was declared ended, the states all then had to go back and say, do you actually still qualify? As a result of that, as best as we can tell, the low income rolls for the entire Commonwealth of Massachusetts fell by almost 7,000 students, which is the largest fall off we've seen since we actually changed how we do counting in 2017. As best as we can tell, that's part of Mass Health. Now, the low income enrollment is done essentially quarterly. It's done 4 times during the year. We will get hit with another wave next year. As you know, your FY26 budget will be based on this coming October's count. There will be another round of students who essentially have dropped off within the SIMS data that the state uses for this determination. So this is my sort of waving a warning flag. That has, of course, come up in budget deliberations and some of the Ways and Means testimony. All right, next slide. And I didn't say, by the way, that school committee members, if you have questions, I know they'll want you to use the mic, but you should stop me anytime. So the final sort of piece of the puzzle here, at least in terms of a student-based part of the formula, is special education. So there is a rate for in-district special education and a rate for out-of-district special education. Yes? Oh dear. Getting a chat that the sound is off. I know that I'm hooked up to the room. I don't know if... I can hear it just fine. Okay. So it sounds like other people on the Zoom are able to hear, so I will keep barreling along then. If you click again, so as much as these numbers look maybe reassuring, because they're the highest ones we've seen, the thing about the low income rate, when you get a second, just click again, thank you, is that this is not based on actual enrollment. So everything else you've seen so far is based on that October 1 count that the school district submits to the state, based on the SIMS data. It's based on how many low-income students are actually directly certified, based on the number of students who are still considered English learners, have been tested out in terms of access. This is an assumed rate, and it is based on an assumed 1% of enrollment for out-of-district placement, and what is going up to a 4% enrollment at the end of the Student Opportunity Act. It's 3.93 this year for in-district students. For entirely vocational districts, it will end up being 5%, it's 4.93. So that's another 1/6 implementation. This does represent the 4th year of the Student Opportunity Act. Now, so just so that you know that this didn't come completely out of the air, what it is based on is full-time equivalency. So most students who are receiving special education services in your district do not spend all of their time in special education services. What essentially the state did was say, okay, but if they did, what percentage of your population would that represent? On average across the state, it was 4%. Now, we can argue that one until we're blue in the face. The Foundation Budget Review Commission had several rounds on it. In fact, ably represented at that point by then Chelsea Superintendent, now Co-Executive Director Mary Burke of Chelsea, now MASS. But that is where that's coming from, okay? It will not represent your actual cost. It doesn't to anyone. It will not represent your actual enrollment. It doesn't to anyone. Okay, next slide. So if we then put the pieces together, The bottom is that base foundation amount. How many kindergartners do you have? What's the dollar amount? How many elementary school students do you have? What's the dollar amount? And so on through the grades. For the second part, we then add to that the English learner increment. How many K5, 6, 8, 9 through 12. Then we add your low income enrollment. How many students are directly certified? And then what group are you in? And then we add the special education percentage on top of that. That's what becomes the pieces that get put together in your foundation budget. Next slide. So here's the other piece to this. We've talked a lot about the Student Opportunity Act and the changes that are happening. But the thing that used to be true, and the thing that at its most basic level it continues to be true of the foundation budget, is the foundation budget really only changes from one year to the next because of two things. One is your enrollment, right? You have more kindergartners this year. You have fewer students who are considered English learners. You have more kids who are considered low income. That will change your foundation budget. And then the other thing that changes your foundation budget is the inflation rate. And there has been an inflation rate. I'm trying to remember if I actually booby-trapped this so you have to click it that many times. I'm sorry, you might. As part of the foundation budget, it doesn't matter what I'm the one doing it. Now I feel like I'm making you do all this extra labor. As part of the foundation budget from the beginning. Now, inflation is one of those words that gets used a lot in headlines. And I think many of us think that we have a general sense of sort of what it means and where it comes from. And then I have school committees and everyone else who gets confronted with the foundation budget inflation rate, which is coming from something that no one has ever heard of, and is not actually associated with any of the places that you get the word inflation rate anywhere else. So the intent and the association when this was put together was that the inflation rate should be attached to something that had some sort of meaning for school district budgets. Fair, reasonable kind of thing. What they attached it to was something that's called the Implicit Price Deflator Index for state and local governments, which is a measurement that's done by the United States Department of Commerce that is actually looking at how much municipalities, school districts, and states spent over time, and they do it quarterly. What the foundation budget inflation rate does is it looks at the change from one fall back to the previous fall, okay? So I actually ended up speaking to someone at the Department of Commerce about this to make sure I actually really understood what they were doing here. When you think about it that way, it potentially makes some degree of sense as to why, first of all, for the last couple of years, it would have been a supercharged inflation rate. Local communities were receiving a significant amount of federal aid that were designed to do all kinds of things, right? First of all, save people's lives. Secondly, make things healthier for them. Make sure people weren't losing their jobs, which was actually part of both ARPA and the first round of ESSER. And then things like improve ventilation, work on learning loss, provide additional mental health supports, all those other kinds of things. So there was a lot of federal funding that was flowing through local communities and through states the last couple of years. As a result, in FY23 and in FY24, we had inflation rates for the foundation budget that actually were higher than the cap that is part of the Student Opportunity Act. So something that didn't get a lot of press when the Student Opportunity Act was passed, and I as much as anyone actually didn't talk about it either, was that the inflation rate in the Student Opportunity Act is capped at 4.5%. So whatever the inflation rate from this implicit price deflator is, if it is higher than 4.5%, the highest the inflation rate will go is 4.5%. That happened last year and it happened the year before that. Depending on when you calculated it, it was somewhere between 6 and 9 for both of those years. This year, there, as best as we can tell, has been a lot of states that have already spent all their ARPA money. There's a lot of towns that have funded most of those efforts. We've been seeing districts that, districts all know that September is coming and that's when ESSER 3 has to be spent. So as best as we can tell, the foot has come off the gas a bit, right? Now remember, this is increases. This isn't that, right? So how much is it growing? And so the actual inflation rate, and man, you want to hear a lot of conspiracy theories. Talk to school committee members wondering where the 1.35% comes from, okay? But the actual inflation rate, because I've done the math myself to make sure it's actually this, is 1.35% for this year. Now, we've got a lot of people in the room who know a lot about local budgets. I don't know a lot of budgetary categories in municipal side, school side, any side, that are only going up by 1.35%, okay? If you asked me to summarize the story of municipal budgets this year, that one column is most of the story, which is that nobody's costs are going up by 1.35%, no matter what you do, no matter, right? So, however, that is where we are. So that is part of the story too. If you click, I think we get a box that probably says a lot of what I just said, yes. The only other thing I want to add is that as a result of the Student Opportunity Act, remember I said that health insurance was a part that was of concern. Previously, health insurance was included as part of this same inflation rate, and then we'd go have conversations that would say, look, even if we get an inflation rate that looks pretty good, like 3.75%, nobody's health insurance is going up by 3.75%, right? So part of the Student Opportunity Act is it ties just the benefits column of the foundation budget to a 3-year average of the state GIC rate. GIC is the sort of the statewide insurance option that municipalities and school districts can use. Ties it to something closer. This year, that inflation rate is 5.03%, which may still not be what your health insurance is going up by, but it's probably closer than 1.35. Okay, next slide. So for the Northampton Public Schools for FY25, this is your spreadsheet. And there is a reason that I don't start with this, because first of all, some people get really nervous around spreadsheets. There's a lot of numbers here, but a lot of these are things that you've actually already seen in various kinds of ways, right? So this column over here on the left, or actually depends on which way you're facing, is the administration, instructional leadership, teaching, and so forth that we listed off before of what you need. You can see across the top the grade levels of the base foundation amounts with the enrollment in the Northampton Public Schools as of the October count. That black bar then gets us into the increments over the base foundation amount with special education in district, special education tuition out. Remember, those are just taking percentages of the total enrollment. And then going back to actual enrollment, we have English learners in pre-K through 5, 6 through 8, high school, and then the low income direct certification count. In every case, you can actually see the dollar amounts through each of those increments, and then a total across the bottom. And that gives us a foundation budget for the Northampton Public Schools of $35.9 million. Now, if you click again, I can give you a friendlier version of this, which only gives you essentially the numbers that are most associated. Enrollment, the per pupil amount, and the total by each of the grades and categories that Northampton Public Schools actually have. Do note, see, it does this where it actually stops using everything below special education in district is supposed to be italicized. And doesn't count towards the total, right? So if you have a student who is an English learner in high school, they are also in high school. They already counted once. Don't count them twice. And of course, the special education are not sort of actual students in any case. Still giving you that $35.9 million. So something that I think is important, because remember we talked about how this is at ground an enrollment-based formula, right? It's a per pupil amount, it says that right in chapter 70, is what actually these numbers have looked like. So if you click again, this is the Northampton Public Schools enrollment going back to 1994, which is as far back as the state actually shares the data. Not uncommonly, there's been sort of a bit of an overall drop off in terms of enrollment, not enormously, but overall. And also, the thing that I think is important to know is that, I mean, not going to surprise any educators, but from one year to the next, you can have the enrollment kind of go up and down, right? This is not necessarily a steady kind of thing. Then the other thing that I thought was important to give you is what are some of the populations that are in the Northampton Public Schools? So it looks like if you click again, we're going to end up with a slide that I did something weird to. Yeah, okay, there we go. So I'm looking first at students with disabilities, which is not showing up well on this screen, but you essentially are having something that's hovering around 20%, pretty steadily back to 95 all the way. And then looking at sort of the other two categories of selected populations, the green here along the bottom is English learners, which hit 5% in 2024, and has been It's been above 1% going all the way back. You had a period for a while there that was about 1.5. And then the low income, which I think tells a really interesting story. I picked like all the wrong colors for this, didn't I? But the low income over here goes up this past year to 42.2%, okay? And it has actually gained a bit over time. The green star there is 2017, which is when we redetermined how we were doing it. In many districts, that actually led to a really big change in count. It actually didn't in Northampton, which itself is kind of interesting. But these, first of all, they're going to tell a foundation budget story, right? That actually makes a difference in terms of what's going on with your students. But it also makes a difference in terms then of not just sort of your revenue, your foundation budget side, but also in terms of what you then actually have to do with your budget, right? Because this gives you certain expectations in terms of the needs that you need to meet for English learners, for students who have disabilities, and for students who are low income. All right, next slide. So because your student enrollment and the inflation rate and those other needs bounces around, so does your foundation budget. And the years here where the dollar amount is outlined in red, the foundation budget actually went down from the previous fiscal year, okay? Again, whoops. We are moving, we're getting. So essentially then there's a couple of places where the foundation budget actually dropped from one year to the next, okay? The most obvious one, of course, is FY10 to FY11, where it went from 25 to 19. But there's a couple of places where it actually just, it went down. So the thing, of course, to know, and I will say this, but this should, again, not be news to anyone here, is that just because the foundation budget went down doesn't mean that the budget actually went down, because the costs probably didn't go down. The thing about the foundation budget is it is, first of all, a per pupil rate. It also is an inflation rate. Students don't have a convenient habit of sort of vanishing in like classroom-sized clusters, right? And so the needs that the district actually then needs to sustain over time don't necessarily drop just because the foundation budget did. All right, next slide. So that was the first half. That was the fair and adequate minimum per pupil calculation. Now we actually have to come up with the fair and adequate minimum per pupil, which is, remember, the other half of this calculation. So the first thing to know is we're going to actually now back ourselves up to the state level, because some of these calculations actually sort of first happen there and then impact the local level. Next slide. So at ground, before the state does anything else, they take the foundation budget for the entire Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and they say, okay, here's the deal. We're going to divide up paying for this foundation amount, this fair and adequate per pupil amount for the entire Commonwealth, with the following division. A 59% local funding and 41% state funding, okay? Now, something that's kind of interesting, I think, is that this didn't actually used to be written down. It is actually now written down as a result of the Student Opportunity Act. It has been true dating all the way back to 1993. Only recently did I learn that that's because that was pretty much what the balance was at the time the education reform law was passed, and everyone said, okay, I guess we'll keep that. Now, the thing is that may have been the balance. There wasn't actually any kind of standard calculation in terms of how you got that state aid. Now we at least have that. So this is among the many things that has been coming up a lot this year, is whether or not that balance is appropriate, right, something people want to continue. All right, so if we have that amount, and then the state says, okay, so of that 59% local funding, we're going to say to cities and towns, we expect half of that to be coming from property wealth and half of that to be coming from income wealth. So if you click again, what the state then does is it takes the equalized valuation of all taxable property in the entire Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and, next slide, it then takes all of the, I think we should have a click again here. Yes, all of the income, again, derived from DOR filings, for, again, the entire Commonwealth of Massachusetts, next slide, and it sets them equal to each other. So it takes that whole giant total in terms of property wealth, takes all that giant total in terms of income wealth, and it makes those numbers equal to each other. So if you are far removed from the use of decimals Like, put yourself back in the classroom where someone was actually teaching you to use decimals. You may have a vague memory that if you need to take two numbers and set them equal to each other, you multiply one by one, a number over one, and you multiply the other by a number less than one. That's what we're doing here, okay? So every year there are these decimals that are derived from the state level. The only thing we're going to take walking away from that calculation is those two decimals. And they are going to follow us through this calculation for every single city and town in Massachusetts, okay? We're going to apply those to everyone. And that's the common local funding effort of Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 70, Section 1. That's where we're getting it from, these two decimals. Okay. So what the state, yep, go ahead.
From that slide, I'm sorry.
Yep.
From that slide, I believe that the income is weighted more heavy than the property.
They're weighted equally.
But what, so can you, I need a little bit more explanation then, the 1.4 versus, I don't remember what they are.
So remember, what they're bringing one up and one down. So it's actually doing the reverse. You're actually bringing the income up to meet the property, which is coming down. Yes. Yep. So from the town level now, right, now we're going to say to Northampton, okay, how much of that 35 million that we just came up with is Northampton going to fund from local obligation? What the state is going to do is it's going to lay out the following. It's going to take the 2022 equalized property valuation, taxable property, and the 2021 income. It's going to multiply them by those decimals we just saw. Those are considered, that's the uniform property percentage and the uniform income percentage. Again, every city and town does this the same way. That then is going to give us two numbers, the local effort from property wealth and the local effort from income wealth. If we add those two numbers together, what we end up with is something called the combined effort yield. And that is essentially saying if we take that income and that wealth, how much can they together then make for the town to put towards education, okay? So for the next, I think, slide, here we go. So for every town, then, they're going to take that taxable property wealth, multiply it by that common percentage, and that's going to give us that local effort. We're going to take the local income, multiply it by that common percentage. That's going to give us local effort from income. And then the sum of those together is going to give us the combined effort yield. And that then is that Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 70, Section 1, if you click again, standard local funding effort. All right? So if we look then at, I think the next slide is actually Northampton. Okay, so if we take that sort of exists coming off of essentially the numbers that we know in terms of local revenue. The next thing that the state's going to do then is take that combined effort yield and it's going to say, okay, if we have that number, which is a local contribution number, and we have the foundation budget for the city of Northampton, what's 82.5% of the foundation budget for the city of Northampton? Now, the reason for the 82.5% is that the state has also made the commitment that every community, every school district, will get at least 17.5% of its foundation budget in state aid, regardless of their local ability to contribute to schools, okay? So essentially what the state has said is, we are gonna cap your required funding, required is a big word here, at 82.5% of your foundation budget, so that everybody gets state aid, okay? So they're gonna take your combined effort yield, they're going to take 82.5% of your foundation budget, and they're going to say, which of those two is less? They're going to take the lesser of those two, and that becomes your target. Now, the first thing that they do is they turn that into a percentage of your foundation budget, and they say, okay, you have to fund, we're trying to aim for you to be funding X% of your foundation budget. It can be 82.5%. If you go to Holyoke, I want to say that it's something like 15%. It could be anywhere in between. Okay, and again, that's based on either your local ability to contribute from income and wealth, or 82.5% of your foundation budget, whichever is less. This actually is particularly important for Northampton. Now, They then actually look back. So that's sort of like all kind of doing some math, which largely is based on sort of local ability to contribute and so forth. Then they get down to brass tacks and they say, okay, but how much did we require you to contribute last year? And they take last year's contribution and they multiply it by the municipal revenue growth factor, which I think is the next click, which is how much the town's revenue grew in the past year. Okay? And again, this is a DOR thing. It actually is sort of coming from real local numbers. Those two numbers, that calculation, that last calculation, is your required local contribution. Well, it's leading to your required local contribution because they're then going to do one more thing. They're going to say, okay, given this preliminary local contribution where we looked at last year's and we grew it by the same amount local revenue did, where are we compared to this target that we set in the first part of the calculation? And if you are under your target, which most towns in Massachusetts right now are because the foundation budget has been growing, okay, so it's for good reasons, they then are going to say, well, how much are you under your target, okay? If it's 2% or less, we're fine. We consider it even. If it's 2 to 7.5, they're going to bring you up by another percentage. And if it's 7.5 or more, they're going to bring you up by 2%. And that's, I think, the last click on this one, which is that they do a little bit more math at the end. So this then is going to, yeah, one more click. And that then is going to be that giving within those parameters is going to bring it up to actually give us the required local contribution. They do this calculation again for every city and town. Now, I was going to say this anyway, but particularly because Smith Folk is here, it's important to know. The city of Northampton has a foundation budget that is not the same as the Northampton Public Schools Foundation budget, okay? And that's not just true here. It's true anywhere where either a town is a member of a regional vocational as well as a K through 12 or whatever it is. But keep in mind that there is a foundation budget for the city of Northampton. That's where this 82.5% is stemming from. That's what this calculation is coming from. When I do it with a regional district, I have to pull each town individually because they each have their own foundation budget. Okay, so just keep that in mind. We're not exactly talking about the Northampton Public Schools here by themselves. Okay, next click, I think we'll say for every town. Yep, so just to give you an idea then, this is a sheet that actually is looking at Northampton's contribution, okay? And when Northampton has a local required contribution, then how does that get divided up between the students who are going to Northampton Public Schools and the students who are going to what the state refers to as Northampton Smith, which I never think of it that way, but that are going to Smith Folk. So this is again, it's looking at foundation enrollment, the foundation budget, the top part is last year, and then we're making the changes to get us to this year. Essentially, you've got like a 90-10 split, okay? Now remember, this is going to be based then when you sort of think about what's the contribution. The contribution is based, yes, on enrollment, which is the part that everybody knows and remembers, but it's also based on local ability to contribute, okay? So depending on that percentage of your target and your local ability to contribute, the amount that's coming from the state versus the amount that's coming from local is going to depend. Next slide. This is looking specifically then at the city of Northampton for this calculation in terms of local contribution, okay? So we take the city of Northampton's 2022 equalized valuation, taxable property, about $4.2 billion. We multiply it by, I told you these decimals were going to be your friends by the end, uniform property percentage, okay, that's the 0.39 that we saw before, and that's going to give us the local effort from wealth, about $71 million. Then we do the same thing for income. If you click again, for income, there's your math. $1.3 billion, again, standard uniform income percentage, then gives us local effort from income of about $19.2 million. Click again. Okay, and you can see then the differential, right, in terms of where they're coming from. The combined difference, wait, that doesn't work. That's not 71.35. Something is wrong here. I'm going to look back at that. The rest of this, though, is right. So the FY25, you click again, the FY25 foundation budget for the city of Northampton is $39.7 million. Remember we said we'd look back at what the maximum local contribution is, that 82.5%. That gives us 32.8. So 32.8 is less than 35.7. 35.7, remember, was the 82.5%. So your target local contribution is that 82.5%. Now, here's the thing that I think is really important, though. I think if you click again. Yeah. So your target is 82.5%. But the thing that's actually really interesting here is this for Northampton. We have communities where their combined effort yield far exceeds their foundation budget. Okay, they have a combined effort yield that's 200% of foundation, that's millions and millions of dollars more than foundation. And they're also 82.5% communities because that's what the cap is. Northampton is hovering, the last time, if I did the math, I think you're hovering somewhere in the mid-80s. You're at something like 85%. So you're actually like legitimately at 82.5% community. You're not really being brought down that much to 82.5%. And if I think we see the next slide, I think you'll see some of this. So your target, again, this is your target, remember, the 82.5%, with the local, that being your local share, with the aid share then being the 17.5. But I wanted to go back and look a little bit at the municipal contribution a little bit more, because that I think is actually the crux of the story for, it's really the story that I think a lot of cities and towns now really need to know. So the next slide. So the municipal revenue growth factor is made up of 4 things. Okay, remember this is we did the math based on the foundation budget, okay, but how much did you have to contribute last year and how much are we increasing it by? It's that 2.5%, which is the proposition 2.5, plus new growth, plus state aid, and plus prior year receipts. And it will give us then a percentage increase in the revenue growth of the municipality. So what I did is I pulled the municipal revenue growth factor for Northampton for the past couple of years, just to give you an idea of what that has looked like, because this is what your local required contribution will actually grow by. Now, this is, remember, it's scaled to 6%, so there's a little more drama here than maybe is actually put for. But you know, it's hit a high of 5.65. It's 3.85 this year. This is really kind of the story from the local revenue perspective to kind of keep an eye on, because this is actually really what your local required contribution is largely going to be raised by. There's a little bit of a story at the bottom, but really that's the big piece of this. And if you click to the next one, which I've actually put together, this is actually the full part of the spreadsheet. Yeah, see, those numbers actually work a little. No, that's still not. I'm going to need to look back at that. There's something going on with that. But on the right-hand side, the FY24 required contribution was $30.9 million. Here's your 3.85 on the right-hand side. I think if you click, we'll go square. And so then what is the preliminary contribution? It's 32.1. So look at that preliminary contribution as a percent of foundation. That's 80.8, right? How close are you to 82.5? You're pretty close. So really that's the math that's going on here. You're actually not going to go up by anything more because you're so close to, you're under 2% in terms of how close you are to your target. And actually, I think if you click again, we'll go square at the bottom. Yeah. Okay, so, and then that is if we click again, the standard local funding effort, right? Now, I wanted to give you, if you click again, so this then is actually what the actual required balance is in terms of getting you to foundation, okay? 80.81 with 19.19 coming from state aid. So, next slide. So I've been doing a lot of these slides across the state because I think that the untold story of the Student Opportunity Act is this. When we passed the Student Opportunity Act, we talked a lot about Lowell and Lawrence and Holyoke and Pittsfield and Fall River and Worcester and Springfield. And we said, you know, high need districts, limited ability to contribute. Real story is we got to make sure that we're actually supporting those districts. Constitutional mandate, right thing to do, whole 9 yards. Okay. The thing that I think we didn't talk about, and maybe it's partly because people didn't actually realize this is what was going to happen, is what it did to districts who have had a history of having foundation budgets that have gone down. Now, if you have a foundation budget that goes down from one year to the next, what the state does is it says, okay, so you would do your local contribution, you would get your foundation aid, because remember the deal is always the state's gonna get you to foundation, but the state is actually not gonna cut your aid if you have a lower foundation rate budget from one year to the next. What they do is hold you harmless. So you get the same amount of state aid that you got the previous year, and then the state also kicks in an increment over that per pupil. Over the past number of years, it has been 60, it's been 30, it's been 50, it's been a number of different numbers. Student Opportunity Act puts that at $30 per pupil. Now, on one hand, no one wants their state aid to go down. No one wants to not have their state aid go up. On the other hand, this can mean that you end up with state aid that has an increasingly limited association with your foundation budget and your enrollment. And the problem with that is it makes it less and less likely that you are ever going to get anything other than the minimum increment, because there is a bigger and bigger gap between your foundation budget and the amount of actual state aid that you're getting. And that is where Northampton was. If you look at the difference between where the yellow line was and the top of the blue is state aid, the yellow is the foundation budget, okay? So if you look at the differences in FY19, FY20, FY21, FY22, now we start putting the foundation, start putting the Student Opportunity Act into play though, and then what the Student Opportunity Act did more than anything else is it was a huge driver in terms of foundation budgets going up. That means the yellow bar goes up much more rapidly, and it puts Northampton that much closer to actually getting foundation aid. And the thing that I told Senator Comerford when she called me about what was going on with Northampton is one of the ones that makes me angriest, because if we had an actual inflation rate that worked this year, I think you probably would have been able to hold harmless. And instead, you're falling back farther in, okay? And that drives me bananas. If you click again, I've got a couple more slides here that give you some context. That's actually the same one. Sorry, sorry. So this zooms in a little bit more, that's what it is. I always start my slides to go to 0, but so that you can see more clearly the difference the Student Opportunity Act made in terms of the gap between the yellow and the top of the blue and how close you were actually getting. What I didn't do, I'm always torn on this because sometimes my bubbles get too much and it gets too busy. I didn't give you a pullout of how much it was. I want to say it was something like $150,000 last year, which should have been enough for you to be able to blast out this year if we had an inflation rate. Yes? 400 below, yep. They would have blasted out. Thank you.
Could you go back just a couple steps to what you said? If Northampton, then we would have been able, something, then we would have been able to.
So part of what, if you look at the difference, so you can actually even just see it on this. See the difference in the change of the yellow line, the foundation budget, between FY22 and FY23, and then FY23 and FY24, it's steep, right? There's a lot of growth. Your foundation budget went up by a lot. Now, that's partly Student Opportunity Act, but you're not that high in terms of your low income, so it's not that much of a driver. It's partly those 4.5% inflation rates. But it is also the growth that you're seeing within the Student Opportunity Act. What we're seeing for almost every single district, in fact, I don't know of a district where we're not really seeing this, is essentially the growth of the Student Opportunity Act is causing in the foundation budget is running into the fact that the inflation is not that high. And so you're seeing these foundation budgets that, I mean, it's not leveled off, but it's certainly not going up by very much, which means that that push you were getting to get you out of hold harmless has kind of stopped this year, okay? And so you have a bigger amount, again, blue doesn't really help you, although maybe you can see it better on that screen, is that there's a bigger gap between your foundation budget and the amount of state aid that you're getting in total this year compared to last year, okay? I'm gonna give you a couple more, I think this is where I put these. I was doing these in the parking lot because I wanted you to give sort of a regional picture, right? So like many of you, I look at the Daily Hampshire Gazette front page every morning. So I tried to pull a couple sort of from the headlines, right? Amherst has been in the news a lot. Now, the first thing I want you to know, I've got Amherst, and then I've also got Amherst Pelham Regional here. Amherst's story is not Northampton's story, okay? If you look at the difference between, essentially their hold harmless, right? How far is that blue bar go above their foundation budget? For the Amherst Elementary District, it's about a $3 million difference. This is not an inflation story here, okay? If you click, we'll get Amherst Pelham Regional, I think. Same deal. It doesn't want to do Amherst Pelham Regional. Again, I may have actually thrown off my own slideshow because I was like, I want to, yes. Yeah, there we go, okay? For Amherst Pelham Regional, the difference is about $6 million, okay? That's not, the foundation, the inflation rate is not the story for that. Now, if we click again, we have South Hadley. South Hadley, of course, has also been in the news for their budget. But for South Hadley has actually had gotten out of hold harmless. That's what's going on in 23, 24, and has gone back into it because of the low inflation rate, okay? And then if you click again, East Hampton is, that one caught my eye too because they are among the districts that fell back into hold harmless this year. Okay, they were out, they went back in. Okay, to go back to Northampton though. So the story is for every district, they always are going to take your local required contribution, they're going to put that in first, so we can click. And then they're going to fill the gap between that and your foundation budget with foundation aid, that's the green. And in your case, because that would have been less aid than you got last year, they're also then going to add the difference, which is about $1 million. And then in the governor's budget, there's a $30 per pupil addition on top of that. Okay, so that's what the state aid picture looks like for Northampton. Now, the mayor asked that I also give you a sort of, okay, but now what, right? And I know my own district is not facing exactly this story, but similar kind of story. And I want to know, what am I supposed to do? Okay, so here's the story that MASS, MASC, AFT, MASS, and MTA actually jointly have been advocating for, is the next one. So this, you might recognize, this is your required local contribution, okay? I want to assure you about, in terms of this story, if the foundation budget from January were to increase because of a proposal in the House by a different inflation rate, or in the Senate by a different inflation rate, it does not change this part of the story. It doesn't change the local contribution, okay? Say that to, among other things, reassure the mayor. So, everyone is on the same page here, okay? So required local contribution is gonna be this because it's based on last year's contribution times the municipal revenue growth factor. And the target here, okay, is you're already at that such a small difference. And this is the part that I thought was kind of almost really exciting is you can't, there's only so far you can be below target, right? What's the, the most they're gonna ask you to contribute is 82.5%. You don't have 2% to go to. You can't get dinged. You can't, no matter what, how they change the foundation budget, there is never gonna be a difference that's gonna result in math needing to be done in this quadrant, okay? Because this is so close already to your target. So that's why that slide is there, to say you're that close to your target, there will not be a change there. The question of the inflation rate then becomes one of, if the inflation rate goes up, the foundation budget goes up. It's actually then going to have to be picked up by the state aid side of the calculation, okay? And that is the story of what we're seeing districts across the state and also local communities and FinComs and so forth say is 1.35% is not actually doing it. It's not actually the story. And that in terms of relief, that is actually the piece that we need. Now I will add my own additional addendum to that. We often see people wanting to advocate for a minimum per pupil increase, and I understand why. First of all, the math is easy, right? Secondly, it's gonna be the story that, say, Amherst needs, because I don't know, there's not a lot of other things that can happen there. The problem, though, is that for districts like Northampton, or South Hadley, or East Hampton, what it's gonna do, if that is what is done, is it's gonna add up that difference that you have between your foundation budget and the state aid that you're getting. And remember, we've only got 2 more years of the Student Opportunity Act. So this sort of accelerator we've been seeing in the foundation budget goes away after FY27, and we don't know what happens after that. So what I would argue is that we're gonna lose, for the districts where that matters, we're gonna lose additional ground these years. It's part of my frustration of the $60 per pupil last year. Personal one, but nonetheless, that's how the math works. So that is where we are. I think my last slide, shouldn't go back to that. Yeah, I got confused at the end here, is one for questions. Because that's more or less the Chapter 70 story. It's a little bit of a complicated one this year, in particular because of where we are in the cycle. But I'm happy to take further questions if you have them. You don't have to clap. Or we can all sort of sit and mull that for a while. I will, of course, actually give you, I want to go back and check my numbers on that. I don't like it when my numbers don't add up, and that's a recreated spreadsheet is what that is. So, but I will actually share the presentation with you as well, of course. Nothing else? All right. Are there any questions online?
I have a quick question.
You have a question now,
And
yes.
then I'll check online. I think Emily just raised her hand. So could you just talk a little bit more about that minimum aid? So I know that I did advocate for us looking at not just the $30, but to increase that to at least $100.
Yes.
And so how does that offset our foundation budget if we're trying to get to that hold? Beyond
Right.
hold harmless.
So if we click back, can we click back to sort of the zoom in on Northampton? And if you need to, if I need to come over and do that, that might help. Yeah, and so let me just note that when I tell you about this sort of like minimum dollar per pupil, Dr. Barner's being polite and not noting that I'm actually somewhat going against the advocacy of MASC and MASS because that was actually part of their public testimony. So the short answer is, let me just be clear. The first answer is that if you get $100 per pupil, you will get $100 per pupil, and your state aid will go up by $100 per pupil, okay? That's not a bad thing on its own. However, do, of course, keep in mind how much that's actually going to be, because I also have done a lot of presentations to a lot of school districts and said, okay, fine, but go do the math and tell me that the whatever it is, right, is going to actually save your bacon in terms of your district budget, because I have yet to run into one where that's actually the difference, right? The thing about the minimum per pupil is the legislature gets to do something that people asked for, which they appreciate. Local communities have a thing that they asked for that's concrete. They get it. The budget goes up. Okay. The part can we do the sort of the bar chart that is the years, but it's Northampton and it zooms in. Yes, thank you. Sorry. That's what I get for adding all these slides to the last minute. There we go. This one. Okay. So remember that the reason that there's a difference between the foundation budget and the blue bar, right, is because the state is continuing to give you that same amount, and plus it's adding. So if you have that happen year after year after year, if they're going to give you the same amount and a little bit more, then the next year they have to give you that whole amount, including that little bit more. And then if it happens again, they have to give you that whole amount and a little bit more. Meanwhile, your foundation budget is bobbling along down here, okay? You're making the chance that this foundation budget is ever going to get up here, where you get actual increases that are more than $30 per pupil, significantly less. And that's why when I pull these charts, part of the thing I'm looking at is, okay, but what is the difference, right? So if it's $150,000 and your budget is large enough, there's a pretty good chance that you're actually going to make up that difference. If what has happened over time is, I'm thinking here, for example, of the city of Franklin. City of Franklin has like $10 million in hold harmless. The ability of them to actually ever get out of that, regardless of what happens to the foundation budget, is small. In Northampton's case, though, your gap was so small, adding to that difference this year, if there's a chance of instead the foundation budget going up, like, so either way your aid goes up, right? $100 per pupil, your aid goes up, inflation budget, your inflation rate, your aid goes up. But if you do the inflation rate, then the chance of you in the next couple of years being able to be foundation aid communities rather than minimum aid communities is that much more. So and I mean, playing the odds is a fluffy way of putting it. It's a better chance than that. You can do the math. But it's really that question. It's sort of are you advocating for something that will help this year and this year only? Or are you advocating for something that actually puts us on a step that continues forward? And really that's the frame that the joint letter that came out from MASS, MASC, AFT, and MTA last week actually said was essentially, hey, so first of all, there was this other inflation that was happening in these 4.5 years that didn't get acknowledged. How about if we take some of that inflation and we put it into this year, right? And next year up to the cap. And then what that does is then that builds into the base, but it builds into the base of the foundation budget rather than just becoming this additional Chapter 78. Is that better? It is absolutely one of the more complicated things because people say, how come I'm not going to advocate to just get more money per kid? Because and it's also much easier to explain, believe me. I've had that conversation more than once, but we can advocate for that because it's easy to explain. This is more complicated to explain, but it does become essentially are you getting aid just for this year? And, I mean, I shouldn't say just. Are you getting an aid increase this year, or are you getting an aid increase potentially that also then builds in a way that is productive for the next couple of years? And I will say that part of this is legitimately my also sort of continuing to look down that how many more years left do we have of implementation where we're getting this sort of rocket ship effect of the Student Opportunity Act. By the way, you're making me sorry that I didn't pull Smith-Vokes numbers. Besides, it's always fun to do the regional Vokes local contributions because they end up looking like layer cakes. It's this much from this city, it's this much from this town. Yes?
So how much would the inflation rate have to increase?
Yep.
To get us out of the risk of then falling back into hold harmless?
So the unhelpful answer is that it depends because it's going to depend on what happens for the next 2 years, not just stateside, but also in terms of your enrollment and in terms of your municipal revenue growth factor. So I'm sorry that I don't have a neat and easy answer for that.
And then after 2027, we don't know what happens.
After 2027, this is why we probably want to start saying, hey, how about we have another Foundation Budget Review Commission? Because I mean, inflation rate is certainly a hot topic this year, right? The 5941 is a hot topic at the time. I've had more conversations about Proposition 2.5 this year than I've had during the 8 years I've worked for the association. And these are just sort of off the top of my head. There's other things you could be adding to this list.
I'm going to call on Member Sarfi Cox.
Yeah.
Can you unmute?
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate this presentation, Tracy, and I'm sorry that I can't be there in person. Some of my questions have already been answered. I was wondering definitely about this inflation rate issue. So I guess one question that I have is, sorry, I can hear myself echo. One question that I have is the inflation rate, is there potential for it to still change this year, or is it baked in for this year and so therefore we're only advocating for it in future years? And I have a second question too, and no, I've lost it.
Okay.
You'll remember.
Well, I'll answer that one and you think about it. And also, those of you who are on Zoom, please ignore my notes because as you can tell, I carry over slides from one year to the next and these notes have nothing to do with the slide you're looking at. The magic of the legislative process is that the governor proposes a budget in January and then the House gets to propose a budget in April and the Senate gets to propose a budget in May. And in every case, part of the budget is the language that actually describes the foundation budget for that year. And that includes the inflation rate. Now there's a standard, there's standard language that is actually, was part of the Student Opportunity Act, it's written in Chapter 70, that essentially is the inflation rate that we got. It is entirely within the power of the legislature to put something else there. Either to wholesale substitute a different inflation rate, or I've heard it described as to actually essentially have some sort of an inflation gap filler. They could do that too. But there's language that describes what happens to make this work. And both the House and the Senate do have the purview to be able to do that. Now they then would need to hammer it out together in conference committee to come to the same conclusion. But you do not need to give up hope for this year, I guess is the short answer. Now I will say that sort of the implied second part of your question, which is this the right inflation rate? Do we want to do something different for the future? Is also a perfectly legitimate question. I've heard the 1.35% described various kinds of ways. And I honestly think that this is one where, much like a lot of things because of the pandemic, we kind of couldn't see this one necessarily coming unless we'd sort of spelled out all of the consequences of having all of this federal aid fall off and what that then would do to this particular increment. It certainly wasn't something that anyone was seeing when the legislature was passing this in 2018. What else?
Yeah, thank you. And then my second question was partially answered. It was a question about the end of the Student Opportunity Act. You said that there's a 6-year implementation of the Student Opportunity Act, and then does it sunset and they have to replace it with something, or just parts of it will fall off, including this foundation budget accelerator thing?
So essentially what happens at the end of that is that we will have hit the goal rates that were set within the Student Opportunity Act, and then that will become the rate going forward, increased only by inflation, not increased by anything else. So we won't be seeing so the benefits percentage is now tied to the GIC. That will stay the same. But there have been incremental increases in guidance and psychological services. There have been incremental increases in the English learner increment, in the low income increment, and then that what will happen is we'll be at the 4% and the 5% for in-district special education consideration, and then that will be what we'll be flying with. Then we'll be back to a reality in which the only changes that will be happening will be those of enrollment and whatever the inflation rate is.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's helpful.
Good.
And apologies for asking a third question when I said there was only two.
No, don't apologize.
But that brings up another question for me, which is about actually special education. I know that statewide there's this assumption that the special education rate is a particular rate. I want to say it's like 19%. Maybe it's lower than that, and many communities, Northampton included, have higher special education rates, but because they base it on that assumption rate, there's not the additional, there is additional support for special education, but it comes from a completely different place and it is not a full compensation. So I guess I'm just wondering, within Chapter 70, is there room for additional support for special education to, support levels of special education that are actually supportive of students with disabilities?
So I think that between the out-of-district tuition increase we saw last year, which was that 14% increase, and then some of what we're seeing this year, I would say that this is sort of another hot topic. So there isn't any other space in the foundation budget that describes support for special education. As you're intimating, the circuit breaker does reimburse districts up to a certain percentage for high cost individual students, either in district or out of district, although it's a reimbursement, it doesn't upfront. I do think that, again, from what I've seen, this is one of the conversations that districts want to have again, which is everything from the assumed percentages to the actual costs involved to the relationship with in-district and out-of-district. I should mention, by the way, another piece of the Student Opportunity Act, which is part of the circuit breaker, it's not part of this, is that tuition, the reimbursement now does include up to 25% of the transportation, which previously didn't include transportation. But I would acknowledge that the concern that you're flagging is one that is not infrequently being flagged. So I don't have a here's where the additional dollars could be this year, but I think that you're putting your finger on another, someone needs to have this, this needs to be a conversation that is had. Yeah.
I had a similar question about special ed, but my other question is that 17%?
Yep.
Would it make a difference? I assume that there are some districts who could pay everything.
Yes.
Would it make a difference if that number changed?
Sure. But interestingly, it would make a difference in terms of kind of the amount of money that then became available to the state, right, that they then could do something else with. So it actually, interestingly, wouldn't change your story because you're an 82.5 and you're kind of legitimately an 82.5. For the districts that are an 82.5 and actually are like 225% for combined effort yield, I have heard people say, okay, but what if they were 90%? Because I think that there is a bit of probably statewide resistance to saying, well, we're not going to tell districts they can't get any state aid. We can argue that one too, but I have heard that floated. But of course, what it would do is it would then say, okay, so the state has some more money available. Could they do something different with it? I should note, by the way, that when you end up with districts that are hold harmless and minimum aid, they are consequently being funded over foundation. And so kind of we're doing this interesting thing where we're doing two things at the same time, which is we're bringing up foundation because we think foundation is inadequate. The districts that we actually focused the most on during the debate over the Student Opportunity Act, which are the sort of Lowell, Lawrence, and so forth, are actually only being funded at foundation. Any districts that are hold harmless and getting minimum aid are being funded over foundation by the state. So there's a bit of sort of irony implicit in terms of what we're doing there. Sure. Anything else? Senator, did you have your hand? Yes.
So first of all, Tracy, thank you. You really are actually a Commonwealth-wide treasure. And just so folks know, Tracy was at the hearing on education and local aid at Greenfield Community College and providing expert testimony. So one of the reasons I wanted to come this evening to see you and to be with my colleagues in local government is because I think the state has a huge role to play. As Northampton grapples with really significant budget challenges, you've pointed out tonight the way that the state can and should do better, right? So I wanted to be here to own that and to be with you in these challenges so that local colleagues don't feel, like that the whole thing that you're grappling with, Mayor and team, is on your shoulders. It's not. And so you've pointed out a number of ways in which the state is not doing what it can for minimum aid districts. So 211 of 318 districts are minimum aid right now. So Northampton's in big company, right? I think that's outrageous. The other thing that's true is that every single one of my districts in the state Senate has special education numbers above the assumed percentage. I also think that's outrageous. And I do think the fact that the state hasn't been willing to grapple accurately and adequately with special education was a failing back then. I wasn't around then, but I am now, and I think it's a tremendous failing. It's a very pejorative reason that we're given, right? That if we actually allow school districts to count the number of students receiving special education services, that districts could, quote unquote, pad their budgets. I find that outrageous, right? It's not respecting educators or school leadership, right? We want students to thrive in the highest possible setting and not to be encumbered with services that they don't need, right? So it's a very, very pejorative, very insulting way that I believe the state, and I'm on record here, so I'm not saying anything, Tracy, that I haven't said publicly before, the state shortchanges districts with special education. I also think the assumed percentage, the CEY, the combined effort yield that Tracy talked about, is also something that has to be looked at. I want to raise the cap completely. Now that wouldn't help Northampton, as Tracy has said. It wouldn't help Northampton completely, but it would help some of the lower income, poorer rural districts in this Senate district. The other thing I just want to say is I absolutely think that the 59-41% balance has to be rethought, right? We just have to do it, especially with as many minimum aid districts as we have. And then finally, I just want to say that twice I have asked the administration in these hearings to open up a conversation on Chapter 70, right? We are coming to the end of the Student Opportunity Act phase-in, and we have to start a new budget commission, Foundation Budget Commission. We have to look at the ways in which it has benefited some and not benefited others as much, although I think what Tracy showed us this evening is that Foundation budget has been growing for Northampton underneath minimum aid, right? You haven't been able to see it because we're a minimum aid district, but it's been chugging along. And if we had had the same inflator as the year before, we would have seen Chapter 70 for the first time instead of minimum aid. And it would be a different story here. And I told the mayor, we did a little back of the envelope calculation last year, and I said, if we don't lose as many students, and if we have the same inflator, you will see for the first time in Northampton, Chapter 70. Anyway, this is all to say that I'm on the hook to carry this burden with you. And there are things that we can and should do. And anytime Northampton invites people like Tracy to come, you raise your voices. And I hope we join together and take on this new chapter. It is the minimum aid rural district chapter that we have to have. So thank you. I just wanted to let you know where I stood on there's more issues. But anyway, by the way, I filed bills on all of these. We're getting somewhere on some of these bills. We're not getting somewhere on other of these bills, but it is, I believe, on my shoulders with you and people like Tracy to do this advocacy. So thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Yeah, I mean, to add, I know, my hometown's numbers are so large that sometimes they're not easy to grasp, but I was at the Worcester Legislative Breakfast last Friday, and Worcester offered that they are underfunding, so the special education is undercalculated by $52 million a year. So, what else? It is a lot. It is a lot, yes. I mean, though I will say that as much as I personally see a lot of drama in spreadsheets, right? So when I open up my hold harmless and see the sort of, either like with the South Hadley and East Hampton, the, zero hold harmless, damn it, they have hold harmless, or you all where the number is going down and should have, and then goes back up. I mean, I would say that the hope I would offer is that the Student Opportunity Act was actually, as the Senator noted, was actually working for you. It just was, you hadn't gotten to the next step yet. And I would say that that's why it's another good argument to argue for inflation in terms of, not only this year, but also then your ability to move forward. Sure. All right.
I think member Seraphy Cox is the only one who's online, but if there are no further questions online, any of you all? No? All right, Tracy, thank you from the bottom of our hearts.
Absolutely.
We really appreciate it.
Glad to be here.
All right, we have to adjourn, yeah? Motion's been made by Member Hennessy and seconded by Member Gazy.
All right. Member Mayor Gina Louise Shiera.
Yes.
Member Holly Gazy.
Yes.
Member Karen Foster Cannon. Oh, she had to leave. Okay. And Emily Seraphy Cox.
Yeah.
Okay. Member Ann Hennessy.
Yes.
Member Margaret Miller.
Yes.
Member Carrie Labonte.
Yes.
And Member Aileen Davis.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Really appreciate it.